This video is designed to cover and talk about the origins of the Cold War, mainly the presidencies of Truman and Dwight D. Eisenhower. There's a little bit of debate about who actually coined the term or who came up with it. And there's two theories. The first one is it was coined by Bernard Baruch. He's been around advising presidents since World War I, and he's the one who coined it. Other people saying, no, it's really this journalist, Walter Lippmann, again, been around since the 1930s for a long time, and he's the one who coined that term. You want to think of the Cold War as being a Cold War because there's no actual direct fighting between the United States and the USSR, but there are some hotspots, or proxy wars as we call them, being Korea and Vietnam most famously. So we're going to cover and look at the origins of the Cold War, some factors that led to it, and some big important events that help push us into and develop the Cold War. So when we think about factors that help do this, there's a number of things. And really it has to do with the stark differences in post-World War visions. Right, and those visions are kind of laid out in the conferences at Yalta and Potsdam. At Yalta, most importantly, the big three, Churchill, FDR, and Stalin, agreed to create the United Nations. They agreed to host free and fair elections in Eastern Europe. And the USSR also agrees that they will join the fight in Japan. Because remember, Yalta, this is before we use the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the United States is really fearful that we're not going to be able to defeat Japan just by ourselves. There is, as we get closer to the end and after we use the atomic bomb, there's increasing distrust because now the USSR knows that the United States has the capability of using the bomb and is very fearful that the United States is going to use it. In addition to this, there's also a difference in the post-war visions, right? The USSR is deeply scarred by having been invaded by Germany not once, but twice in the past 50 years, right? Remember from the Century video, they really hated the Germans, right? And Stalin believed that Russia specifically needed a buffer zone between Germany and Russia. And that being Eastern Europe. So he really wants to take over Eastern Europe. The United States wants to focus a lot more on rebuilding, decolonization, disarmament, and really creating this a safe, democratic peace. Plus, you have the whole German problem of what do we do with Germany? How do we divide it up? We've got East and West Germany. We have occupation in Berlin, and that's going to lead also to the Berlin Airlift. So here you have a map of Germany and also of how it's divided up by country, right? And then also the division between Berlin, or within Berlin, and West Berlin. Before the Berlin Airlift occurs, we have the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan is also called the European Recovery Program, in which the United States gave $13 billion in grants. Grants are not loans. Grants are free money. You, like Oprah, you get some money, and you get some money, and you get some money, right? The United States was not expecting to be paid back. And really the reason why we do this is we want to prevent communist uprising or infiltrations to vulnerable nations that are deeply weakened by the fighting in World War II. The United States does not offer any money to the Soviet Union. However, money is offered to Eastern Europe. However, Stalin forces the Eastern European countries not to accept that money. But the Marshall Plan really does help prevent Western Europe from developing into communistic countries, most of the money going to the UK and to France. It is during this time period that you have the policy of and the overarching idea of how the United States is going to view the Soviet Union and the Cold War. And that's the policy of containment created by George Kennan. Right? We want to contain or limit and keep the communist nations where they already are, keep them there, and prevent the spreading of it. You have the creation of the Iron Curtain, right? Designed and first used by Winston Churchill. You can pause video. You can pause video here and you can play that one. Truman also passes the Truman Doctrine, that's specific money to both Greece and Turkey to prevent it from becoming communistic. And the United States passes a number of measures, mainly the National Security Act of 1947, which created the CIA and the National Security Council. And also NSC 68, it's a directive that justifies increasingly large defense spending, about 20% of GDP, because we need to build up our arsenal as a way to deter and prevent the Soviet Union from gaining too much power. The Berlin Airlift occurs. It lasts for over 11 months. 200,000 flights were done each day. That's about a plane landing or taking off every 30 seconds in Berlin. 47,000 tons daily were flown in to Berlin to help keep it democratic. And this was really something that Truman said that we are going to do to kind of stand up to the Soviet Union. You can play this clip here, and there's a link in the description about the Berlin Airlift and the Candy Bomber. It's kind of a cute old guy. You also have the development of Warsaw and the Warsaw Pact and NATO, NATO being the first and the Warsaw Pact being the Soviet Union's response to NATO. NATO is a really important thing to know because you can use it as good evidence for the United States becoming interventionist and not isolationist, as a big change in foreign policy from previous decades and centuries. We also have the Korean War, which is often seen as the forgotten war in American history. Some important effects of the Korean War. It's kind of the forgotten war in American history. We still have thousands of U.S. troops stationed in South Korea. The North Koreans never really fully industrialized. However, it takes South Korea about 10 years to slowly industrialize, and then in the 1960s it takes off and booms into what is currently today about the 13th largest economy. Technically, for the Korean, on the Korean Peninsula, the war has never ended. There has just been an agreement to stop fighting. And you can also see from this image, you also see the stark differences in industrialization. Right, you clearly see South Korea, and then North Korea is rather dark compared to the South. And then that's China up there. Nuclear warfare becomes a more imminent threat because of the development of ICBMs, right? And those ICBMs are put on submarines. So there's a constant threat of nuclear attack because now you can move your submarine anywhere. And now, well, other cities that didn't really feel threatened now feel threatened because of the mobility of these ICBMs. Here you have a graph of the stockpile of United States stockpile. Generally, we see a trend going down, especially in the half-decade following the collapse of the Soviet Union. But we see a predominant buildup. The United States builds up around 1965. We reach our peak. The Soviet Union reaches a peak in the last 4 years of its existence, right, in 1985. In the United States, because of the increased threat of nuclear warfare, you have this phenomenon of, needing to educate students and make sure that they are safe, and that's through the duck and cover. The alarm would sound. Students, as you see there, would be told to hide underneath their desk in the event of an actual nuclear war, a nuclear bomb going off somewhere near them, and they would be safe. It's not effective. Eisenhower, real quick, his new policy you need to know is massive retaliation and the domino theory. And also Eisenhower specifically uses covert operations and the CIA rather than direct military involvement. This is where you have the development of the domino theory, which is also going to be continued all the way throughout the Cold War. And here you have some cartoons of the domino theory. Tibet, North Korea, Indochina, Malaysia's next, right? Australia. There are some softenings, specifically the spirit of Geneva, and then, however, that is ended with the Hungarian revolt, in which Stalin suppresses that revolt and that democratic uprising quite severely. And finally, Vietnam, which we're going to talk a little bit more later on, but also in the last years of Eisenhower, you have Cuba is becoming communist. We're going to talk a little bit more about Cuba under JFK. Last bit, you have the space race developing under Eisenhower. The Soviet Union is the first one to launch the satellite with Sputnik. That forces the United States to create NASA and actually more education money for science and math, which is a plus. Right? And finally, this is the last piece, is Eisenhower's farewell address. You need to make sure that you are familiar with the farewell address and the military-industrial complex. Warnings of a military corporate state as a way, because they mutually benefit each other, as a way to make more money and profits through fear and corruption. So that's about it on Truman and Eisenhower and the early Cold War. You guys can watch this again or go back and pause. But there we go. Early Cold War. Hope you have a good day.